The history of space exploration. Human firsts, the early to mid-60s. After we got satellites into orbit, of course the next goal was to get a person into space. And just like with satellites, the Soviets beat us at every step of the way. First person to go into orbit was Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union. He completed one orbit, which is about 90 minutes in space, and then he came back down. Now, the Soviet Union is mostly landlocked, so landing meant landing on ground. And so they had a parachute system to slow the capsule down, but they weren't entirely sure that it would work. So for their first few flights, they actually had their passengers, and Soviets called them cosmonauts. Of course, in the United States, we call them astronauts. They had the cosmonaut eject from the capsule and parachute down separately, just to be sure that they didn't get killed on impact. So Gagarin wins for going into space first. The irony is, the reason the Soviets got a person into orbit first was because their nuclear warheads, which is what the original rockets were designed to carry, were not as efficient as ours, so they were bigger and heavier. So they had to make rockets that could deal with these bigger, heavier nuclear warheads. We had more efficient nuclear warheads, so we didn't have to build as robust rockets. So we had to catch up on the rocket front. Our first man into space was Shepard. He was part of what's called the Mercury program. This was the name of our first human space program. There were 7 men chosen for the Mercury missions. But his flight was what's called a suborbital. Basically, he was shot straight up, and then he came straight back down. He did not go into orbit. We did not have a rocket powerful enough to go into orbit. So his entire flight was roughly 15 minutes. You'll hear 15 or 16 minutes, somewhere in there. But it was what's also called a cannonball shot, just up and down. Then, after Shepard's flight, the Soviets sent up German Titov, and he had a complete day in orbit. It was about 17 orbits. He also has the distinction of being the first person to experience space sickness, which actually slowed down the Soviet program for a while because they were concerned that anyone going into orbit was going to be violently ill the entire time. We finally got an American in orbit with John Glenn. I realized I haven't talked about dates. The others were in 1961. This is 1962. He was our first American in orbit. He completed 3 orbits. He was originally scheduled for 7, but there were some warning signals that brought him back early. It turned out it was just a faulty detector, but better safe than sorry. So he became a huge hero because of finally reaching that milestone of going into orbit. I think it was 1965. I could be slightly off on the year. Soviet Union had another human first, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. This was largely a propaganda coup because they said, oh, well, we can send a woman up. It must be really easy for us to put people into space. She was a professional parachutist. She did like stunt parachuting, and so they figured that was useful skill for somebody who may have to eject from their capsule and parachute back down to Earth. So they beat us with satellites into space. They beat us with people into space. They beat us by a long shot with women into space. But we're just about to catch up.